Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Ellen Fanning. Coming up, the government allows the Biloela family to be reunited in Perth, but their fight is far from over, with settlements still to be decided. G7 nations commit to ambitious carbon targets by 2030. So will the government's commitment to coal see Australia left behind? And super funds are pushing back against new legislation that would allow the government to ban them from investing in certain areas. Joining me on the panel tonight, Managing Director of Yatsen Associates and Labor Party member Jason Yatsen-Lee. Good to see you.
Good to be here. Joining
us shortly from Canberra, lawyer and writer Nigel Nguyen. Also in Canberra, political and international editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, Peter Harcher, is with us. And in London, CEO of the Principles for Responsible Investment, a UN-supported network of sustainable investors, Fiona Reynolds. Lovely to see you, Fiona.
Good to be here.
And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDrum, and we're on Facebook. Well, the government appears to have budged ever so slightly on the matter of the Biloela family. You'll remember they were living in the Queensland town of Biloela until March 2018, when the visas of Tamil-born parents Priya and Nades expired, triggering a deportation bid by the government and ultimately landing the family in detention on Christmas Island. But the saga remains unresolved tonight. The family will now reside in community detention in Perth, where the youngest daughter, Tarnika, is in hospital recovering from sepsis.
Obviously, everyone has compassion towards the two children and the two beautiful little girls in this family. Everyone is responsible for what has occurred, including the families, including the lawyers, including the activists, including the government. Because they arrived by boat here, that is the circumstance they are in. They are unlawful non-citizens. Their immigration status has not changed. I have made a compassionate decision that they can live in the Perth community.
The government's decision today has been met with criticism from across the political spectrum.
The Commonwealth Government should allow the family to go back to Biloela in Queensland. That's where the father has worked. That's the community that they know people in, and that would be the best solution. So if this is a transition to that outcome, well, then that's good. But if it's some sort of holding pattern and they're not making a decision to give the family and the community certainty, well, then that's not right.
Crucially, today's decision means that the family's long-term status will remain in limbo until ongoing litigation and an application to the High Court is heard.
If the Minister was to intervene, the High Court application would go away. Our other position would be that, even continuing them in community detention still costs the taxpayers money, and I don't reflect that it does really meet Australian community expectation. If I could add that of all the emails that we've received, we have so far only received one email or one message that has been against what we have been doing.
Nigel, can I start with you? Welcome to the program. Why do you think the government has had a change of heart? This family have been in, well, the parents have been in the community for 9 years now, and this saga has dragged on and on and on.
I don't think that the government does necessarily have a change of heart. I think they've been dragged to this position, thankfully, by common Australians of all different backgrounds, insisting that this position is just simply unacceptable and it can't be maintained. My only question is that if this was a compassionate decision, why is the compassionate so limited? Why not just allow them to go into the community? I think some of the arguments that have been advanced against why this family is being detained just don't hold up. The first one is that it's going to open up the borders, but clearly, ministerial discretion has always existed and will always continue to exist. And I think a minister discretion just justify why this is necessary, because there are just going to be cases that can't fit neatly into a particular principle or rule of law. So that just means that we have to look at that case in that particular context and choose what would be just to do in that case, even if it might not follow a particular order of things that we've had. The other one is the idea that it weakens our position on mandatory detention. I think, Australia, whether we like it or not, we're known to have one of the toughest regime when it comes to detaining asylum seekers and people seeking asylums. I don't think because we've just managed to detain 2 little girls in a shorter period than the entire of their lifetime or whatever alternative was supposed to exist to this is going to minimize the fact that we are still a very tough country to come to by boat. So I think that a lot of these excuses don't work, and I'm really glad that the community have come together to push for this family to be resettled. I mean, the conduct, to be honest, of the government, and I'm going to sound harsh here, it reminds me of these comments that kids use nowadays, which is a flex. It feels like flexing for the sake of having power and using 2 little girls to make a point. And I think a country as rich and as powerful as Australia that claims to have compassion to be flexing and its 2 kids just for the sake of power doesn't look right. And I think that's why so many people from different political persuasion are saying, stop it, it's enough.
Jason, many migrants to this country rely on a fair system, as Nidal did, right? Nidal, born in a refugee camp in Ethiopia, grew up in the Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya. And you were waiting, weren't you? You were waiting all those years, Nidal, to be resettled, and there's this notion of an orderly system where people should sort of, in a sense, stand in a metaphorical line for refugee or asylum status or a skills position. And Nidal's nodding ahead there, but I mean, is it in some people's minds an affront to that notion of fairness? And I'll come back to Nidal after this.
Look, I think there is a notion of fairness as part of the Australian character, but I think the government and just how this whole mess around how we treat asylum seekers has been engineered. I think that is tapped into something much darker in the Australian character, and that is that we are an island and we just don't want sort of people, we're fearful of people coming in, and we're fearful of large numbers of people coming in, and it's tapped into that. So hopefully...
But the rhetoric that goes along with that, and it does reflect a reality, were those terrible drownings at sea that we saw as a result of desperate people being encouraged by criminals to come to this country and risk their lives to do it.
Absolutely, but I think that they are primarily intellectualised arguments that stated a logic for why the policy was so harsh. And it makes sense logically, it makes sense intellectually, but I still think that there was something much darker going on here. I think for Australians to accept something so cruel and so torturous to people, there's something that has overridden that sense of fairness. But in this case, I think the politics has changed, because what has happened is that this family has become humanised because they've lived amongst us for 10 years. They've lived in a community in far north Queensland, not known for its progressive and left-wing attitudes, and have been embraced and welcomed. And I think that through that process, they've been deeply humanised. And I think the politics and the perceptions of this have changed.
Well, Nidal, what about that notion? I mean, the idea that is advanced is that, let's imagine your family, in a one-room mud hut where you grew up in that Kakuma refugee camp, praying for resettlement for all of your childhood, and that somehow...
But see, like I was...
This is an affront to that.
See, I don't think it is, though. I don't think it is, because as desperate as I was, and as I used to wait for my mother to pray, because I thought she had a stronger faith and God would be in a better mood if I kind of follow up after her and beg to be resettled. As much as I was desperate, the only thing I was missing was a boat. And I think this is what the harsh policy that we adopt doesn't seem to understand. The poet Wasan Shire says, nobody puts their child on water unless the water is safer than the land. People make these hard choices because they have no choice. The idea that somehow the harsher you are, you will punish them out of the possibility of pursuing a hope, it's impossible. Yes, they're going to be drowning because people are desperate. It's not acceptable. But the idea that you punish 2 girls to make an example of that, or it's going to stop people from coming, it won't. There is also no line. There are 65 million refugees around the world waiting for a place to be resettled. Now, I'm not arguing that Australia has the compassion or the resource to take them all, but where in a 65 million line does a desperate mother or a child wait? these are complex issues, of course, that need to be balanced, which is why there exists a ministerial discretion, which is why in some cases, despite the law we adopt, there's gonna come a point where power is not the answer. Here, what we needed is empathy. It doesn't make us any less aggressive on immigration policy. In fact, it makes us just reasonable human beings that are presented with a set of facts and are able to make the most just decision in that case. I don't think it makes us any weaker, as much as I disagree with the Australian immigration policy.
Peter, it seems like the message, I read a letter from the letter to the editor in the Canberra Times, and the notion was, again, this notion of a fair, just, orderly system. And then Australians have seen over the last however many years the children taken from their cots in Biloela to be taken from that community. Then they went to Melbourne Detention and we saw vitamin D deficiencies, which is related to nutrition. Then we saw little Tarnika, the younger child, her rotting teeth, and some of her baby teeth had to be removed. And again, that related, I guess, to nutrition and to oral health. And now here she is on a rock in the middle of the Indian Ocean and having to be flown to Perth with blood poisoning and pneumonia. And I mean, to what extent has that close up been an affront to that notion of a fair, just and orderly system? And if Australians really are affronted, why is the hashtag just home to Bilo? Why is there no broader concern about the system as a whole?
Well, the system as a whole isn't really, despite some of the atmospherics and the rhetoric, isn't in question. Just to remind, this is not a coalition policy. This is a national policy. The Labor Party supports this policy. In fact, it was Kevin Rudd who introduced this policy that nobody arriving by boat can ever be settled permanently in Australia. He was the Prime Minister who relaxed John Howard's border policy, in response to which there was an uncontrolled influx, in response to which Rudd then imposed the current policy. And then the coalition followed up with an enforcement mechanism which has proved extremely successful, stop the boats. So that is not in question. What is in question here is within that broader bipartisan policy, is there scope for some humane treatment of the people who fall foul of that system? And of course,
only the ones we can see?
Well, at the moment, we're not accepting people from anywhere. But I would suggest to you that this is, when an individual case like this becomes prominent in the public eye, then the public will form an opinion on it. And in this case, the public opinion is very clearly in favour of the Murugappan family. And there is scope, so the first question is whether there's scope to treat people humanely within that non-negotiable framework. And the answer is yes. And, you know, while the government loves to talk about, and you quoted a letter to the editor, people talking about due process and fairness and all the rest of it, as part of the due process system of immigration in Australia, there has always, from the very beginning, been tremendous discretion in the hands of the Minister for Immigration. He has a very powerful ability to do pretty much what he wants. So to hide behind process in a case like this is political. This is a political judgment on how to manage this case. And I would also point out that the Minister has kept his options open with this decision today. He said that while on the one hand, he'll allow the family to leave Christmas Island and to go into community detention in Perth, he's also kept open the option of more lenient future treatment. Although he said, you know, they're going to have to leave, he's also said, I'm going to consider so-called bar lift on the youngest daughter, which would then open the possibility of allowing them to stay longer. So my strong impression here, Ellen, is that the government has given the family some relief, and the government has given itself a reprieve to judge public opinion and judge its options. This is a political decision firmly within the scope of ministerial discretion.
We'll pop over to Fiona in just a sec, but just a quick response there, Jason. I mean, as we pointed out, I mean, there's under Section 195A of the Migration Act, the Minister can wave his hand and say it's in the public interest for them to stay, or that notion of lifting the bar. Yes, your application for refugee status for 3 of the 4 family members has failed. But look, ministerial discretion to apply for non-refugee visas.
I just think something has to change in the current system. I think COVID has sort of masked it hasn't been fixed. And probably because of COVID, because of health disasters and crashing health systems, the refugee and the displaced people problem is probably bigger than ever. So I think something has to change about this, and we have to think about more innovative solutions. And maybe, based on this really interesting case, maybe an innovative solution is this notion of community sponsorship, that communities can actually sponsor and welcome refugees that they are partially responsible for and partially responsible for looking after, but who the refugees are also accountable for.
And under this plan that's been announced today, there's no working, there's no volunteering, there's none of those things that they were doing in Biloela. I want to go to Fiona. This is interesting, Fiona. You've been 9 years in London from Australia, so the more things change, the more they stay the same. We're still debating immigration policy, we're still debating energy policy and climate policy, and we're doing all of those things on the television program today. Other things have changed, I just can't quite think of them. So what is your impression as an Australian in London, who's no doubt seen as a representative of all Australians? Are you asked about these matters, refugee matters?
Yes, well, my husband calls this Groundhog Day whenever he looks at what's happening in Australia. So exactly as you're saying. So, because I live in London, I won't pretend that I'm intimately across this case, although I do know it. I also just wanted to add that when I lived in Australia, I was also on the board of the Australia for UNHCR, so the High Commission for Refugees in Australia. And as part of that role, I went into refugee camps in Africa, particularly in Uganda. And I think that anyone who's ever done that would just be horrified about how people need to live. And I think we can't have it both ways. Australia either needs to do more to bring people into the country, or as developed countries, we need to be doing more to help developing countries when they're in trouble and to helping people stay somewhere safe but in better conditions. It horrifies me in the UK when I hear people talking about the UK government talking about the success of the Australian system and that we need something like that in the UK. I hope that never happens. I think that Australia also, when I first moved overseas, and I travel all around the world for my job, pre-COVID of course, I always used to think that people thought of Australians as caring, happy-go-lucky people who were very welcoming. But I do think that's changed. I find that more and more people now ask me, what is going on in Australia? Why are people so close-minded? Why aren't they doing things about climate change? Is Australia becoming more of a racist country? And I think that's really, really sad. And I think that, as others have said, we can have an immigration policy that also has compassion within it and also we need to have good overseas aid to help people in other countries to live in better conditions.
Well, occasionally we come across news so unexpected that we wonder why it's not on the front news page of every paper in the country. In this case, it might be because this news is tied to a piece of superannuation legislation. Come on, wake up. Currently making its way through the federal parliament. In particular, we're talking about the government's super package that is designed to eliminate multiple superannuation accounts and simplify the system for disengaged members. It's already gone through the lower house and will be debated in the Senate tomorrow. So far, so boring. But listen to this. Tacked onto this legislation is a new regulatory power that would give the government the authority to ban investments made by super funds if they deem them not to be in the members' best financial interests. The government said it wants to crack down on a discretionary spending by funds on things like advertising and donations to political parties. But super funds say it will put an increased regulatory burden on them.
We're very concerned that the government is introducing a Trojan horse into the legislation to give them additional powers to interfere in how super funds make decisions about what areas to invest in. The proposed legislation gives them a very broad regulation-making power. So it would be, you know, whoever the government of the day is, the Treasurer would effectively be able to stand in as the chairman of the board of a super fund and indicate what is or isn't, to their mind, in the best financial interests of members. There's a number of things in the legislation that we're particularly concerned about, and it starts from the premise, I guess, of not trusting superannuation funds and reversing the onus of proof. It's a legal burden of proof that normally is only reserved when you reverse it for crimes, serious crimes like terrorism, for example. So it seems like a very much an overreaction when we have one of the best superannuation systems in the world. Currently, for superannuation trustees, they have a duty to act in the best interests of members. What the government is trying to introduce is a new test, which is the best financial interests of members, which is currently how the courts actually interpret that duty.
However, Coalition backbencher Tim Wilson says that super funds are using advertising to intimidate the government.
When you have entities that are established for the purpose of return to members of their own money, and potentially up to $10 million is being spent to try and intimidate politicians into doing their job as elected by the people of Australia, with a clear bullying and intimidatory tone, how is that justified?
Jason, let's start with you. There were no substantial findings about superannuation in the Hayne Royal Commission, the Banking Royal Commission, and Commissioner Hayne wasn't particularly concerned about those, you know, fox in the hen house, here comes the fox for your superannuation. Wasn't particularly concerned about any of that. The Productivity Commission did say that notion that the trustees of a superannuation, where you and I put our money, are forced to put our money for our retirement, should act in the best interests of members. That is the sole purpose of super, that maybe there could be some more clarity around it. So what we've ended up with was, all right, well, let the government be the final arbiter of what is in our best financial interests in 20, 30, 40 years' time when we retire. What do you think of that idea?
Firstly, a few things. Firstly, I'm not sure that I trust the government to be the best arbiter of what's in my financial interests, and I think it's unusual that a Conservative Liberal government would pick government decision making over market decision making. That's quite unusual. But I think the clue to that was in Tim Wilson's sort of piece, that very, very unhappy with what some super fund money is being used for. And so ultimately it's about political control, which I think is what's really going on here.
How do you mean? Political control of what?
Well, if the government is particularly unhappy about a particular investment of a super fund, they want to be able to stop it. Which was, I assume, what Tim Wilson was talking about there, or if they felt that fund money was being used inappropriately for ideological reasons. So, you know, I think the concern is that this is really about wanting greater control over investment decisions that super fund managers are making. But let me say, I mean, super is so complicated. I'm a lawyer, I'm in finance, and I don't get it. And so I think for the majority of young people, it's just so irrelevant. You put money away and you can't touch it for 50 years. It's no wonder that there is this disconnect. And one would hope, if we're talking about superannuation reform, the real question should be, how do we make super much more visible and relevant to young people? I mean, we've got apps nowadays. Why isn't there an app from your super fund
that
just says... But just
you are really disconnected.
Maybe I'm disconnected.
I can log onto this, and if I want to press a button, it'll put $10 on my superannuation.
But does it tell you?
And the magic of compound interest will mean that when I retire, because I'm so young...
But will it tell you? Will it tell you, for instance, all right, today, Ellen, you've made $50 on your investment, or you've lost $30 on your investment.
Does that matter over 40 years?
Or in order to retire comfortably at a certain age, and there's a gender element to this, you are X% towards your target of doing this. I mean, I just think that there's a much more better way to make super much more interesting and relevant day to day for young people.
Okay, now Fiona, this is very much in your wheelhouse. For 7 years in Australia, you were the CEO of the Australian Institute of Superannuation Trustees, and for nearly a decade in London, you have been the head of the UN-backed Principles for Responsible Investment. So your focus there has been not only on environmental and socially responsible investment, but good governance, right? Not using members' funds to do silly things with, ensuring that it stays and is used for their best financial interests. So if you were the trustee, would you be worried if you were making 30, 40, 50-year investments on behalf of young people about the government being able to just regulate quietly, the minister being able to scribble something on a bit of paper that determined what you could and couldn't do?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's ludicrous. First of all, Australia does have one of the best systems in the world, the best accumulation systems. It doesn't necessarily have the best retirement system, but the best accumulation system. The other thing is it is highly regulated by APRA. So it's one of the most regulated systems in Australia. I can't wait. One of the things I'm looking forward to about coming back to Australia is moving my superannuation back into the Australian system, where I have got from my fund 10% returns year on year. You could only dream of that in the UK, and the UK and the US could only dream of having a system like ours. So I think that this is a solution in search of a problem. Superannuation trustees do act in the best long term of their members, and I think that people need to understand that there's a big the current government or the Conservative government has never really been a supporter of superannuation. So it often will refer to superannuation funds and union funds. And it sees that because many superannuation funds have union officials or employer representatives on their board, that this is somehow union power by stealth. It conveniently forgets and doesn't mention the fact that every superannuation board in the not-for-profit sector has to have equal representation. So you have to have equal representation from an employer body and the employee body. And any decision that a board makes has to be done with a 2/3 majority. So you can't just make decisions to invest in your, whatever the latest thing is, or in your political party or things like that. So dealing with the issue of multiple accounts is absolutely important.
And that's another thing that the legislation's trying to do.
Yeah, that's important. But when the government introduced superannuation, it outsourced it to the private sector. So it's got very stringent rules around what you can do, how you invest. APRA looks at all of these things all of the time. What is the problem? Because none of these reviews have ever found that there is actually a problem. Also, how is the government going to determine the best financial interest of super fund members? In a superannuation fund, you've also got intergenerational members. So, a young person joining a fund today, say in their early 20s, is going to be in that fund for 50, 60, 70 years, hopefully, if they've got a long life. And a super fund needs to be thinking, therefore, about that intergenerational mix. It's thinking about the returns over the longer term. It is not thinking about what a government wants to do in a short-term political cycle. And I think that this is what this is actually all about. There's also been, as you said, I work with investors around the world on how do you incorporate environmental, social and governance factors, which are long-term issues, into your investment process. And the government is equally at the same time looking about how you stop superannuation funds, how you interfere with proxy advisors, because super funds are major shareholders of companies. Investors are major shareholders.
They have clout.
Yeah, and they use it and they engage to get the best returns for their members. They're trying to stop that. And I think that's because there's some in the business lobby who don't like that funds are starting to say, well, hang on a minute, what are you doing about this issue and that issue?
Why'd you blow up these caves and so forth?
Yeah, yes, exactly. Or I want your money. I want all of your shareholder money, but I don't want you to have a say about how how the company is run, which is completely
Fiona,
ridiculous.
let me show the folks that Fox in the Hen House ad that I was referring to earlier, then we'll come to Nigel.
Bedtime.
Good night, Doris.
The big banks want to get their hands on your super. And they're putting pressure on our federal politicians to let them in. Banks aren't super.
I don't know if you know that, Nigel. I don't know whether you know that that advertisement in particular. But we saw Tim Wilson saying, this is bullying and intimidation of the government, trying to pressure the government by the profit-to-member sector of superannuation to do what they think is in the best interest. Now, we saw that from the mining lobby when they didn't want the super profits tax. Is that sort of advertising, whether it's by superannuation or the mining industry, bullying and intimidation of government?
If I'm not wrong, I think that was an ad that came around an election time. I'm not sure, but I think Tim Wilson's comments are revealing because it suggests that there's nothing wrong with the super system as it exists. It's just there's political discomfort around how certain super conduct themselves. Now, the argument for me is whether if you have certain discomfort about how unions or other use super money, then that is something that I think you should. There's a question whether that's something that you should take into an election and actually publicly litigate instead of introducing laws to change a system that clearly, as people have said, works efficiently and is one of the best in the world. So I am uncomfortable, I think, by the way this change is being introduced. And I'm uncomfortable because I think it suggests a larger pattern of government overreach. So it's not just in the case of super. We are now seeing debates as well in the context of non-for-profits, where there's introduction of laws, essentially that will mean that charities that advocate especially against things like climate change or take strong position against government positions would be seen as charities that are sort of, advocating and not performing charitable status and might risk their, their charity registration. I think that's another space
status.
of overreach where. Yeah. Yes, so I think it's quite interesting to look at this space and see the kind of the trend where there is introductions of or proposed legislations to be put in place, which the end result is in some ways to achieve an ideological end as opposed to the system itself not working. Because majority of the time, whether you're looking at super or you're looking at the charitable sector, they're highly, highly regulated. And the conduct that the government is trying to make criminal or unacceptable are already governed under existing laws. So in regards to, say, supers, you already have a lot of responsibility within the law on how you should use trust money. And in the context of charities, any behavior that crosses the line can be prosecuted under the criminal law. Yeah. So I think my worry is that you're seeing a shrinking of a space to critically and harshly criticize government, and government is using what I think is sophisticated oppression to silence that space of argument while arguing that somehow this is just, rules and regulations. I think Tim Wilson's really exposed the underlying concern. And I don't think that says anything good about our democratic health. I think if you want to introduce these things, if you want to change things significantly, go to an election, argue it, let people win it on merit, and instead of introducing it through this kind of more insidious form. So I'm very skeptical.
Peter, what about this suggestion that super funds, superannuation being an historic initiative of the union movement with employers to manage members' retirement incomes is being misused to somehow line the pockets of progressive interests or anti-coalition interests?
Well, that's the argument. The big picture here is that the coalition broadly sees the industry, not the retail super funds owned by AMP and the banks, but the industry super funds which do have union relationships and union reps on the boards, the Coalition does see them as ideologically and politically hostile and a sort of potent potential force against Coalition ideals in today and in the future.
But nobody
much
watching,
as they see the university sector.
Yeah, but nobody watching presumably cares about that, because what the headline is the best financial interests of members. So what is your perspective on that? You know, this is a trillion plus pool of funds that's being invested on behalf of Australians. Is it being siphoned off in ways that are not in the best financial interests of members? That's the question.
Well, one thing that the Coalition likes to beat up on, for example, is the New Daily, which is funded out of one of the industry super funds, and it's a daily online news service that the Coalition sees as being left-wing. And so they say that which takes some millions of dollars a year, is a misuse of members' funds. Now, you can address, if that's their concern, things like that, you can address that with trustees, deeds of trust and regulation. I mean, that can be done. This is a giant a sledgehammer that is being put into this legislation, which is why it's about to die. This is not going to happen, right? According to Rex Patrick, the senator who's leading the opposition to it. So the government had two cracks at bringing a sledgehammer to this. The first was a national interest test. So the broad purpose of we shouldn't forget, the broad purpose of the changes to the superannuation system the government's trying to achieve here is actually useful, and that is first so that people don't have multiple accounts.
That's right.
So that when you change jobs, the account goes with you, so you don't burn all your savings in fees being paid to different accounts.
And if you're bored by the discussion, can I just throw in on having multiple accounts, the idea is, and I did have a staple here as a prop, that you would be stapled to your superannuation account. Can you imagine that?
It's very, very unfortunate.
Put your hand here when you form a job and bang, you get stapled to it. And of course the argument that everybody has is, what if they staple you to the wrong one? What if they staple you to a dud and it drags you along for 40 years, bleeding quietly?
Well, you still have discretion to change funds. You can move your super anywhere you want.
So long as you're more invested than Jason, because he doesn't know where it is or what it does, or where you have to be pretty smart 20-year-old.
You have to give him your app, Ellen.
That's right. Take over.
No, look. So within that, and the other overarching purpose of this legislation, of course, is to require superannuation funds to deliver higher returns and to expose the ones that are delivering low returns. So that's sensible, and no one's opposed to that. But they've had two cracks at trying to give the government a sort of a veto button on the industry funds. One was a national interest test, which gave the minister, under unspecified national interest grounds, the ability to block or veto an investment by a fund. Barnaby Joyce, interestingly, objected to that, and so that was knocked out in the lower house. Now the bill's in the upper house, where Rex Patrick from Centre Alliance is getting together with other crossbenchers, Labor and the Greens, to block this second test. And the second test is, as you say, that the minister can decide if something is against the interests of the members of a superannuation fund. And because it's an obvious overreach, because it's politically based, because it's based on government coalition hostility to industry super funds, then it's going to be knocked out. So in all likelihood, this will die on the floor of the Senate when the bill is introduced tomorrow.
All right, so I didn't need my
Ellen,
stapler
can I just come back on? Can I just come back on something there, yes. Ellen? I just wanted to say again to reassure Australians that the superannuation system is highly regulated by APRA, highly regulated. APRA already has the power to remove trustees. So if it doesn't believe that a trustee is acting appropriately, it can remove them. You showed the fox in the hen house ad. Well, when super was first designed and it was brought in by the Hawke-Keating government, it wasn't designed to have choice in it. So it wasn't really designed that you would need to be changing around funds and that you would need to advertise. It was the coalition government who brought in choice. So funds, therefore, do need to be able to advertise appropriately in what they're doing. And in that ad, the funds there were pointing out the problems that were going on within the banking sector. And that was found in the Royal Commission, that super funds that were, not every single case and not every single bank, but there were found to be problems, and it was better for people to be in other funds. And now banks are really exiting the superannuation space at a really fast rate. So I do think that, again, this comes back to what is the problem that we are actually trying to solve. And what will they do? Will they say, oh, look, we don't believe in climate change, so you're not allowed to exit a coal investment, or you're not allowed to make investments in renewables or something because we don't believe in that in our strategy, even though for a super fund, it has to look very widely over the long term. And I think coming back to the ESG issues, COVID has really shown us the interconnected of issues. There is no healthy economy if we don't have healthy people and a healthy planet. And those managing our money need to make sure that they are saving for getting returns for our retirement. But in the meantime, we don't want them damaging the world in the way that they invest. Well, that's a perfect transition to our next story. Over the weekend, the world's richest countries vowed to achieve an overwhelmingly decarbonised power system in the 2030s. The United States, Britain, Canada, France, Germany, Italy and Japan signed off on a communiqué committing to ceasing investment in coal-fired power plants at home and abroad by the end of 2021, and a plan to introduce carbon border tariffs, which could prove costly for our heavy polluting export industries. Now, of course, Australia isn't a member of the G7, but was invited to attend the summit as a guest. Speaking to leaders, including Scott Morrison, after the communiqué was issued, the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson made it clear if you want to be in the room where it happens, you have to step up.
We're now going to be talking about climate change and building back greener. And all we really need the G7 to do, or the Democratic 11 to do, is to make some bigger commitments on climate finance, on phasing out coal, on low-carbon vehicles of all kind, including EVs, and making commitments on protecting nature and biodiversity, which is integral to our struggle against climate change.
Scott Morrison yesterday insisted he felt no pressure in Cornwall over his government's climate policy, repeating his assurance that technology will get us there. But closer to home, there's been a pile-on from coalition partners in recent days on the need to sustain the coal industry.
We will do things based on what's right for Australia. We will do based on what's right for Australian households. 55,000 people are employed in the coal industry and $66 billion of exports that pays for a lot of hospitals, pays for a lot of schools, pays for a lot of barista machines that produces the coffee that inner city types sit around and drink and talk about the death of coal.
Righto, Fiona, there you are sitting in London. Principles for Responsible Investment, UN-backed organisation. You talk about environmental investing for the environment and so on. Does anyone understand in London the social part of all of this, the high-paying jobs in the fossil fuel industry that the Deputy Prime Minister was saying 55,000 Australians rely on?
Well, absolutely. Within the Paris Agreement, there is a part of the Paris Agreement is about a just transition. So that is about that we need to make provisions for those who are going to be affected by the transition away from fossil fuels. So workers, communities that rely on those sectors. And it is a transition. So the problem in Australia is it's not planning for this transition. People are going to stop buying coal. You just talked about what the G7. It's not happening overnight, but it's happening. Investors have stopped investing in coal. Insurers aren't insuring coal plants or infrastructure around it. Banks are not financing new coal plants. The private sector knows what's happening, so I don't know why the government doesn't know. And I don't want to see those 55,000 workers left behind at all. My father-in-law was a coal miner. I want to see the government have a plan for investment in new areas. What can it do for workers to retrain them? What can it do to make sure that they get good jobs? If people are near the end of their working life, can they be given early retirement? So part of what we do is we engage with a lot of companies around the world about emissions reduction, so particularly the largest emitting companies. But we don't just think about stranded assets from the point of view of the assets might not be able to be dug up if we make action on climate change. We think about people as being stranded and communities being stranded as well. And we talk to companies about what are you doing to ensure that these workers have a future. And I just can't see why this is so hard. I mean, look at how quickly and how much money has been thrown at COVID. Why can't we come up with good plans with business, with industry, for the workforce, so that they aren't left behind? Now, I know that we can't replace every job in every place, etc. But we can make plans. And the problem for Australia is that we have a government who always keeps thinking short term, and you can't change your economy overnight. It takes decades and decades, and we need to be having the economy for the future and the jobs of the future for the younger people.
Jason?
I think it's really ironic that the biggest shock to the Australian coal industry this year has come from China's trade bans. And I think in this is, it's such a big contradiction. So if you look at the logic for why we're not leading on climate change, it goes that, we're a small country, our contribution to global emissions is pretty small, and if we were to do it, it's going to really hurt a number of our core industries, right? And therefore, we shouldn't lead on climate change. But yet, we are leading on being tough on China, because the logic is that if we push back with enough resolve, then all these like-minded countries will come and follow our lead. And if we cop any economic pain, then that's a badge of honour that we should. So the political logic of both are completely contradictory.
Nigel, you had a similar reaction to the rhetoric coming from the Prime Minister, didn't you?
Well, yeah, because I actually think some of the reasons they provide as to why Australia cannot have a leading position on addressing climate change equally works for the other side of the argument. We've got two sectors that would be impacted by climate change. That's agriculture and the phasing out of the coal industry. So in a way, there is strong argument as to why, as Fiona said, we should be looking at the notion of a just transition. Promising people that these kinds of jobs are going to exist in the future economy is a lie. These jobs are dying out. Banks are not leasing as easily as they did to new coal mines. So the very two reasons, and I think the third one is what we witness in Australia with the droughts and the floods and the fires. And there was a Royal Commission that looks into this, and one of their findings was that these things would become frequent and more intense. Could any of us truly sitting here imagine the Black Saturday fires being more intense, or the fires that swept through New South Wales that ended up in a declaration of a state of emergency being even more intense? The idea that somehow that we can, in this instant, hold the rest of the world back by refusing to commit our share of action, I think it's truly disturbing, considering all the other things that are happening in Australia. To me, it is the convenient of postponing the inevitable, but I don't think we will be exempt from the harsh consequences of climate change occurring, and I think we are experiencing that. And I think the fact that more and more Australians support action on climate change demonstrate this shift. In all, I think it's truly disappointing, because it's not only short-term in its economic estimate, it's short-term in what we are able to leave our children with. Yeah. We are not the only generation to be alive that should benefit and remain and sustain our comfort at the expense of future generations being able to enjoy a livable planet.
We'll see what happens at Glasgow later in the year. How about that? We've gone almost a full hour without talking about the C word. COVID. You knew it was too good to be true, didn't you? Because Scott Morrison's trip to the UK has reopened the question of when Australia's international borders will reopen. We know that cases are rising in the UK, but we also know that thanks to vaccines, hospitalisations and deaths are not rising in line with the rate of new infections. And while there has been a small increase, the data tells us that this is largely among younger, unvaccinated groups. Today, the British government delayed the planned lifting of all COVID restrictions by 4 weeks in order to get more people vaccinated. But the question for Scott Morrison is whether this is a strategy that we should emulate here.
You've been here in Britain for more than a day now. You've had lunch at a pub in a country with, as you've identified, thousands of cases a day, but also a very high vaccination rate, and the British government says that leads to low deaths and low hospitalisations. Can Australia not learn from Britain about living with COVID?
Well, I'd rather be living in the arrangements we have in Australia than anywhere else in the world, to be honest. Now, in Australia, we've been in a position where we've been able to suppress the virus and keep it out. That sadly hasn't been able to be achieved here.
Fiona, let's start with you. A story written by Latika Burke in the Sydney Morning Herald about you. Leading Australian CEO says border bans forced her to quit global role. You've had enough of the closed borders. Tell me why.
Well, you know, I've lived in the UK for nearly nine years, but I did that on the basis of the fact that I'd go home in and out. I went home for work. I was in and out a number of times, at least 3 times a year. So, you know, I could see my family. London's a global city, and lots of people came over to London for work and other things. And then once the COVID ban came in, like many Australians, it's extremely difficult to get home. And I was really concerned about something happening. And then I suppose the worst did happen. My dad had a stroke. And even though he passed away, and I really wanted to get home to be able to see him. And even though I'm double vaccinated, I wasn't able to come home. And, you know, I think things like that really just make you think, well, Australia has not set out a plan. It doesn't talk about what it's doing with vaccinated Australians trying to get home. There's so many people trying to get home. I know that I am not the only person who's lost a loved one during COVID. I'm not the only person who's had this happen to them. So I'm not looking for sympathy. I'm just saying that, you know, I then decided, look, I can't deal with this. What if something happened to one of my, you know, I've got grown children, but what if something happened to them and I couldn't get home? And I just decided that while I would have stayed in my job, you know, I run one of the biggest investment associations in the world, that the trade-offs were becoming too big. And I think that many Australians that are overseas, they're not looking for handouts from the Australian government or anything like that. They just want a plan about when borders might open, under what circumstances, what about all of us that have been vaccinated in the UK, etc. And I know from some of the groups that I'm in about Australians overseas, they're kind of really furious that they can't get in and out, but the Prime Minister can. Now, of course, he's had a big, important summit. I know that. But it's sort of like, well, why is there one rule for you and one rule for when Matthias Cormann was running for the OECD job, and one rule for different ministers and a different rule for the rest of us? And what are you doing about helping? I'm not a vulnerable Australian, but what are we doing about still helping vulnerable Australians to get home, particularly with vaccinations?
Peter Harcher, is there any movement on this front, particularly for people, returning Australians who have been double vaccinated?
No, there's not. And there are still more than 30,000 Australian citizens trapped out of the country who want to come back and haven't been able to. It's been an extraordinary go-slow in repatriating Australian citizens. And there is no... In fact, quite the contrary, not only is there no movement to accelerate this, on the contrary, the federal government is taking itself out of the quarantining system. So the states operate hotel quarantine, but the federal government operated the Howard Springs camp in the Northern Territory, which was the only one where it's been perfectly successful, not a single escape of a virus into the community, partly because it's cabin-based as well as expertly managed. But they're in the process, the federal government is in the process of handing the management of Howard Springs to the Northern Territory government and getting out of all of the quarantine management systems. So on the contrary, Ellen, the federal government doesn't want to have anything to do with managing or accelerating or enlarging the quarantine, certainly no purpose-built quarantine system in Australia at all.
This isn't hypothetical for you, is it, Jason? I mean, you've got businesses that provide for foreign students. So this is having a material effect on your businesses.
Absolutely, and it's very, very hard to make commercial decisions unless there's a timeline. We don't know when realistically international students are going to be able to come back, and so it's very hard to make investment decisions and commercial decisions around that. But that's just our little business. But at an economic level, we've spent some time in this program talking about climate change. Of our top 5 industries, the 2 that don't involve digging things out of the ground are tourism and international education. And these industries have been tremendously affected by the border closures. So, look, being xenophobic, unfortunately, has become a public health response, and it's been really successful. But we have to be able to look beyond that now and have a plan to open up to the world again.
Nigel, you'll put your hand up in the air and say that you've been reassured by closed borders, yeah?
See, that's I take all the points. I think that the Commonwealth government should do more in the area of quarantine. I do accept that certain just the inconsistency in how the rules are applied, exemptions for celebrities and the rest just leaves a bad taste in your mouth. But I would have to agree with the cautious approach that Scott Morrison is taking. I think it's better in this context to have a cautious approach to opening the borders, because the alternative, it's also not guaranteed that we're going to have stability should Australia get into a position again, especially with our low vaccination levels, into a position where we have to shut down again. Exactly. So I think I would have to accept, taking all the arguments that the other panelists have made, I'll have to accept, that I agree with Scott Morrison's cautious approach to opening the borders.
There you have it, Fiona. That is the view of a lot of Australians right there. I mean, you've got about a minute to make your pitch. How would you have it operate? How would you have it operate if you hadn't thrown up your hands and said, "I'm coming home"?
Like I said, I just like many Australians who live overseas, a plan. Under what circumstances will Australian borders open up? Under what circumstances will you deal with those of us who are vaccinated? All of those sorts of things, just so that we can plan. Now, no one can do anything with certainty in these times, but I thought also it's when you sit in other countries, you sit in the UK. Now, you don't want some of the problems that have happened in the UK, but it's different. It's really about how you live with the virus. It's not about how you eradicate the virus. And we have to accept around the world that this virus is not going away, and how are we going to open up our economies and get things moving again in the safest way possible, and let's just have a plan.
Okay, and so when you go to Heathrow to get that flight home, QF1 home, what will that airport look like? Will there be people coming in from Spain and the United States and Africa and South Asia and everywhere else? Will it be a big bustling international airport?
Well, I don't know. By that stage, I doubt it. But, I feel quite safe getting on a plane. You have to show nowadays that you've had you're vaccinated. I've got an app that shows me that from the NHS. I have to have a COVID test before I get on a plane. So does everyone else around me. I hope that I can get on a QF plane, Alan, but it doesn't look like that Qantas will be flying by then.
Right. But just quickly, because we're about 20 seconds, but if you wanted to go to Spain tomorrow, could you go?
No. International travel from the UK is very, very difficult. It doesn't mean you can't go to Spain, or you could, but then you'd have to come back and quarantine. So travelling overseas isn't encouraged, but it's not impossible to do, and you can do it for business under circumstances of quarantining and all of those sorts of things. Some of it being home quarantined. Yeah. There's a red, amber, and green list, and there's different rules.
Yeah, but you can do it, and
it seems quite sensible. Yeah. And this has come along since we've had more vaccinations.
That's it. Wonderful to see you all today. Fiona, can't wait to see you home, and thanks to all the other members of the panel. Julia's in tomorrow night. Good night to you.